Good morning. All right, I'll try one more time to make sure everybody's awake. Good morning.
Good morning.
All right, thank you. First, I want to thank President Libby for the opportunity to be with you today. As she indicated, when I first became a president in 2004, I'm sending out notices on a listserv for small independent colleges because I had that, deer in the headlights look and drinking water from a fire hydrant. And so she was one of the people who I was able to reach out to help me navigate particularly some of the fiscal challenges that a lot of small colleges face. And so when I received the invitation, there was really only one appropriate response, and that was to be here today. So I want to thank her for this opportunity to be with you, for the folks who were at dinner last night, and for that engaging conversation, which was helpful as I continue to think about the remarks for today. And just for you to be here and to start this conversation about values, I think is very important, something that I'm saying that at my institution, I've been there for a year, we need to go through this process as well to redefine our values because we haven't had that conversation in a while. Some of it has been disrupted by this thing called Hurricane Katrina that happened 8 years ago. So we're at the end of completing our rebuilding and now are in a position where we can talk about moving forward. So being a part of this process has been personally helpful for me and my duties as well. So thank you for having me. Let me make a confession as I start. Well, two confessions. One is I'm always interested when people invite presidents to speak places. So if I'm not good, you have to blame Greg in terms of bringing presidents to speak, because I don't like to listen to presidents either. So if it's horrible, you blame Greg. The second thing is you have a president who watches too much television. And I've watched a lot of television for a long time. It's just a part of who I am as a person. So when I get in last night, I'm flipping through. I have the shows that I, watch regularly, T.I. and Tiny, the Family Hustle. I like that because I'm from Atlanta, so I like to watch T.I. and Tiny, and I'm a big Scandal fan. I'll tell my wife that Kerry Washington is my girlfriend. I sort of got hooked on, I'm just channel surfing. There's this lingerie shop in Georgia. They have this show called Double Divas. Anybody? I'm like hooked on this show. They're making these bras. I'm like hooked on it. So I'm trying to communicate that I weave in a lot of different things in terms of how I present, and you will hear that today as a part of this presentation. Now let me ask another question too. How many of you are familiar with the story of the Good Samaritan? Okay, most people are. The Good Samaritan, very much, it's a biblical parable, but very much a secular story that everyone understands. And so I want to start today by reading that, and this is from a version of the Bible called the Message version. It's written by Eugene Peterson. He's a white male. He's in his 80s, I believe, now. But it really speaks to me as a person from Generation X because it's so plainly written. And so I want to read this story to refresh your memory about this story and then go into my remarks for the day. And those who want to know, this comes from the Gospel according to Luke chapter 10. And I'm going to start at verse 25. Just then a religion scholar stood up with a question to test Jesus. "Teacher, what do I need to do to get eternal life?" He answered, "What's written in God's law? How do you interpret it?" He said that you love the Lord with all your passion and prayer and muscle and intelligence, and that you love your neighbor as well as you do yourself. "Good answer," said Jesus. "Do it and you'll live." Looking for a loophole, he asked, "And just how would you define neighbor?" Jesus answered by telling a story. There was once a man traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho. On the way, he was attacked by robbers. They took his clothes, beat him up, and went off, leaving him half dead. Luckily, a priest was on his way down the same road. But when he saw him, he angled to the other side. Then a Levite religious man showed up. He also avoided the injured man. A Samaritan traveling the road came on him. When he saw the man's condition, his heart went out to him. He gave him first aid, disinfecting and bandaging his wounds. Then he lifted him onto his donkey, led him to an inn, and made him comfortable. In the morning he took out 2 silver coins and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, "Take good care of him. If it costs any more, put it on my bill. I'll pay you on my way back." What do you think? Which of these 3 became a neighbor to the man attacked by robbers? The one who treated him kindly, the religion scholar responded. Jesus said, "Go and do the same." So for our conversation this morning, I want to use as a subject, won't you be my neighbor? Won't you be my neighbor? Told you, I've been watching TV a long time, and persons of my age and older, y'all remember this 1968 show with this little guy that would come into the house and put on the sweater and change his shoes and start singing. It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood, a beautiful day for a neighbor. Would you be mine? Could you be mine? Y'all familiar? Y'all know that show? Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And it was at a time, since this show premieres a year after I was born, I reminisce about where I grew up and growing up in Atlanta and my street, Rodney Drive, and, the people who were making up that neighborhood, and our neighbor to the left, Miss Walker, who is retired, and we were that generation of latchkey kids. You got off the bus, you went into the house, but we knew Miss Walker was next door if we needed anything, or our neighbors to the other side. My father's a United Methodist minister, and my mom taught religion and philosophy, and so when he got a new church, when we first moved to the church and they started the children's choir, and my mom was leading the choir, she had 4 people, my brother and I and our neighbors. We were the 4 that started the children's choir at that church, and our neighbors across the street, Chris and Sean, I remember when they, got a swimming pool, people were over there, and then up from them, Junior and Kevin and Michael, and we all used to play football in the street from telephone pole to telephone pole. It was 4 down, touchdown, and you could tackle on the sidelines, and except in front of Miss Rackley's yard, because she called the police if we ended up in her yard. And I used to get so mad at her for calling the police on us, and I came in and told my dad one day, I'm just going to snatch that wig off her head. And he said, son, don't do that, because I went to high school with her, and I think it's the same wig. So I just remember all the people in the neighborhood and just those memories of, us playing together and hanging out and riding bikes on the trails and all those things that we did. But more and more, we're realizing that newer generations of people are growing up in very different environments. In fact, many of us have an absence of knowing those around us and having those persons that will help make meaning in our lives. Over the past month or so, there was this great build-up to the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington. And a lot of quotes from Dr. King are always presented around that time, including the famous "I Have a Dream" speech. But I also think about this idea that he tried to continue that existed prior to Dr. King uttering it, is this idea of a beloved community. The King Center defines a beloved community as a global vision in which all people can share in the wealth of the earth. In the beloved community, poverty, hunger, and homelessness will not be tolerated because international standards of human decency will not allow it. Racism and all forms of discrimination, bigotry, and prejudice will be replaced by an all-inclusive spirit of sisterhood and brotherhood. In the beloved community, international disputes will be resolved by peaceful conflict resolution and reconciliation of adversaries instead of military power. Love and trust will triumph over fear and hatred. Peace with justice will prevail over war and military conflict. As I looked at the website and information that I was sent about Stetson, a lot of those values of the beloved community are already represented here. You talk about the inherent dignity, worth, and equality of all persons, the importance of community in human life, or as I might call it, even neighborhood. The role of religious and spiritual quest for meaning in human experience, the value of diverse persons and differing ideas in an educational community, the responsibility we share to work towards social justice, and even the necessity for decisions to be guided by ethics and social responsibility. Yet all of our communities everywhere struggle with this idea of a beloved community, be it wherever we grew up, on our campus, our city, state, or even nation. This past Sunday was a reminder for me because that was the 50th anniversary of the response to the March on Washington. That response was the bombing of a church in Birmingham which killed 4 girls. So I think that all of these challenges we have can be healed through a better development of community, or what I would call neighborhoods. So today I want to examine the state of our neighborhoods today and challenge you as well in terms of your role in addressing our neighborhoods. The first thing I would say is that this is an equation. Neighborhoods minus neighbors equals hoods plus hoodlums. Neighborhoods minus neighbors equals hoods plus hoodlums. A neighborhood can be defined as a geographically localized community within a larger city, town, or suburb. Neighborhoods are often communities with considerable face-to-face interaction among members. This is big in New Orleans. I've been there a little over a year now, and you hear people talk about different areas of town, different neighborhoods. The school, Dillard University, is in Gentilly. We go to church in Mid-City. Of course, you have the French Quarter and Bywater and Mid-City and Marigny and Fillmore and Lakeview. All these are very much distinctive neighborhoods as a part of the culture in New Orleans. So I understand the neighborhood concept is really defined there. But then we talk about the hood. It usually refers to an undesirable area, short for neighborhood. Former housing projects in New Orleans, for me, epitomize that. A lot were torn down after Katrina, and they're trying to build back with mixed-use housing. This idea of hood has also been related to a person, sometimes defined as an aggressive and violent young criminal, a thug, a rowdy or violent young person, and short for hoodlum. As I said, I'm part of Generation X. I'm also a part of the hip-hop generation. And several artists have really tried to define what that pain is like in the hood. The artist Common in the song The Coroner says, "Coroners leave souls open and closed, hoping for more, nowhere to go. Brothers rolling in droves, they shoot the wrong way because they ain't knowing their goals. The streets ain't safe because they ain't knowing the code." Lupe Fiasco, the introduction done by his sister on the album Food and Liquor, she says, "They keep funeral homes in business and gunshot wars of hospitals full. Prisons packed, bubbling over in brown sugar, they keep empty. West side lots crowded, hypes powdered, the well is running dry. The days of Malcolm and Martin have ended. Our hope has descended and off to the side, waiting for the reinstallment of the revolution because we are dying at the cost of our own pollution." And finally, the group De La Soul, in the album and the song with the same title called "The Stakes is High," they make it very plain. They say neighborhoods are now hoods because nobody's neighbors, just animals surviving with their animal behavior. In fact, Mr. Rogers has changed. Mr. Rogers is no longer Mr. Rogers. He's Mr. Robinson. Mr. Robinson is now played by Eddie Murphy on Saturday Night Live. Anybody remember Mr. Robinson's Neighborhood? Yeah, some people around that remember Eddie Murphy as Mr. Robinson. And the song goes a lot differently now. He says, "It's one hell of a day in my neighborhood, a hell of a day for a neighbor. Would you be mine? Could you be mine? I hope I get to move in your neighborhood someday. The problem is when I move in, y'all move away. Then, of course, he gives you that big smile with his eyes closed. And this is a story as a part of this parable of the Good Samaritan. A Jew was traveling on the road and was attacked. And our day-to-day reality reminds us that we have people going about their business who are being attacked. I mean, here I am a couple days removed from another mass shooting in Washington, D.C. And as I was sharing with Greg yesterday, I was like, I get so much of my news on Twitter, so I'm checking in the morning, I'm multitasking as I always do, and I'm finding out what's going on there. And we hear these same stories going about their own business. I'm at work, and someone opens fire. And so now we have to relive all these experiences. The Columbines, the Aurora, Colorados, the Newtown. In fact, this was interesting for me to come to this place, and we're talking about values, and I knew I wanted to talk about neighborhoods. And I can't imagine what it's been like living in this area over the last couple of years, because you are literally 25 miles away from the epicenter of the dysfunctionality of neighborhoods. Because I would argue that Sanford epitomizes our current situation. The retreat at Twin Lakes, to me, is the hood. And as an African-American male particularly, I wrestle with this unarmed teen being shot. I was leaving one presidency, leaving Philander Smith, about to move to Dillard when all of this happened. And when these kinds of events happen, I obsess. I mean, when Katrina happened, I was watching the news. It's not healthy, I know it. I obsess over it. During the Zimmerman trial, I mean, it was during the summer, which was good. I didn't have a lot of evening activities. I could come straight home, and I'm at the house working out, and I'm watching CNN, and I'm watching Anderson Cooper say the same stuff later on, which I know is not healthy. Just listening to all of the commentary about what is happening in the trial and wrestling with my own feelings. And my wife, who is an attorney, she's telling me early on, like, dude, they don't have the evidence. This dude is getting off. And I'm wrestling with that, and I'm understanding what she's saying, and I'm listening to the case about the sidewalk being used as a deadly weapon, and I'm like, okay, so how do I register a sidewalk? Because that means I always have a deadly weapon. There are a lot of things that happen, and in the end, when the jury sided with Zimmerman, I was really troubled because it seemed like they spoke about Trayvon Martin and his friend Rachel as they were something other. Almost like they were from another planet. There was no ability to connect with them as people because they weren't viewed as people in their neighborhood. They were not like us. And so we couldn't really connect with them. And then over the course of the last week or so, I've been trying to get into the heads of the jurors and everybody else involved to say, so would your impressions have changed now had the events of the last week where he assaults his father-in-law and destroys the iPad and veiled threats with a gun, would that have changed everything? So that's a challenge for me in terms of, is that a neighborhood? But I'm also very clear that I just don't get caught up because this victim was an African-American male and the attacker was not, because I live in New Orleans and I look at black men kill black men every day. I'm a preacher's kid, and that means that I am proficient in profanity. And if you want to hear me cuss, you can call my house every night starting at 10 o'clock Central Time until the weather comes on. Because I'm cussing the entire time. Because that's what I see. This is what I've seen in terms of the breakdown of neighborhoods in the last few months in New Orleans. In April, we had an AmeriCorps student from Chicago, 18, gunned down walking home. In May, on Mother's Day, second lines are very big in New Orleans. Guy comes out and sprays his crowd. There are probably 50, 60 people. Start spraying the crowd with bullets on Mother's Day. in July. 25-year-old graduate student, Tulane, social worker. She's walking home. It's 12:30 at night. She's tired. 3 guys on a bicycle shoot her dead. In August, a 13-month-old was shot while her babysitter was holding. They were just standing there. 13-month-old killed. And so they have this open casket funeral. The mayor is there. Casket probably not much bigger than this podium. 13-month-old. And then recently, September 2nd, an 11-year-old was killed when a house was sprayed with bullets. In all of these cases, be it Sanford or New Orleans or Washington, D.C. or wherever, neighbors are leaving daily, and only the hoods remain. The second thought is that the hood suffers from rejection. In this story about the Good Samaritan, both the priest and the Levite avoid the man in need. That's an important point. They avoid the man in need. Biblical scholar Warren Risby writes, most of us can think up excuses for the priest and the Levite as they ignored the victim. Maybe we have used them ourselves. The priest had been serving God at the temple all week and was anxious to get home. Perhaps the bandits were still lurking in the vicinity and using the victim as bait. Why take a chance? Anyway, it was not his fault that the man was attacked. The road was busy, so somebody else was bound to come along and help the man. The priest left it to the Levite, and the Levite did what the priest did. Nothing. Such is the power of the bad example of a religious man. You know, in fact, I think we see things a lot, maybe too much, and it's painful, so we start to ignore those things that we see. Eugene Rivers, who is a preacher in the Boston area, says this generation labors under the curse of rejection and has returned that curse with profanity. And so we're seeing these broken families and all the problems that emanate from that. But I want to argue that there are a lot of people out there who are trying to do their best to create solid families, and they need our help. But we're too busy walking by. At the end of July, I was headed to Asheville, North Carolina for a meeting of the United Methodist Colleges and Universities. So we got there Saturday night. The meeting started Sunday afternoon. So Sunday morning, I'm going to get up and work out. And while I'm getting dressed, putting on my workout clothes, I'm watching the Melissa Harris Perry show. This was Sunday, July the 28th. And they had a panel discussion about hunger in our country. And one of her guests was Tiana Gaines Turner from the Witness to Hunger Project in Philadelphia. And so they were talking about Congress and Congress dealing with minimum wage and resources for hungry people. And they noted that each person in Congress gets $383 a month for coffee and food. $383 a month just for coffee and food, people in Congress. And so they go to Tiana Gaines Turner, and they had, Representative Barbara Lee from California and a couple of, university scholars, and Melissa Harris Perry is a professor at Tulane, and Tiana is there, and she brings up that her 3 kids are about to start a charter school in Philadelphia, and they have to have uniforms. And she said 3 shirts cost $50. So as a part of that conversation with Melissa, Tiana says, that's 3 shirts. That's not including socks, bottoms, underclothes, book bags, school supplies. That's just 3 school shirts. Melissa says, and how does a hurdle like $50 feel? I know for some people, $50 is, and Tiana jumps in, it's nothing. But for us, it's a lot. $50 could go toward a bill. It could go toward making sure that, I have 3 children with disabilities. All 3 of my children have epilepsy and asthma. So when you go food shopping and you go to buy different things, I have to be very particular on what I buy. So she goes on then to talk about her work ethic and how her mom raised her. She's married, lives with her husband. They both work, and yet they both have been homeless twice. The second time, they had to get out of the apartment because it was covered in feces, which caused her son to have seizures. They're struggling. They're both working. They have 3 children. And so the segment was really an argument about better wages for all, something, of course, Dr. King would have argued for as a part of this, conversation about the March on Washington. In fact, Dr. King said, be concerned about your brother. You may not be on strike, but either we go up together or we go down together. Let us develop a kind of dangerous unselfishness. Dangerous unselfishness. But Paul Ryan, and they were really looking at some of the remarks that Paul Ryan made because he was against some of these wages. But he said something that was very powerful in the clip that they showed. And Paul Ryan says, when we are talking about reviving civil society, what we mean when we say that is people themselves need to get involved in their communities to help people. That means every individual takes responsibility for helping their brother, their sister, meaning their fellow citizen in their communities. Last night at dinner, Professor Russ was breaking down this idea of significance for me. And we talked about significance, not just in terms of what is accomplished, but sometimes what is not done. We can say a lot of things, and that doesn't necessarily make it significant, but those actions and things that we don't say, that becomes a measure when we think about significance. And at that moment, I'm getting dressed and I'm listening to this conversation. It was a very good, high-level conversation about poverty. And I'm sitting there and I'm getting mad. So that means I was starting to cuss on Sunday morning instead of my normal 10 o'clock. Because I'm waiting for somebody to say, Tiana, I am going to help you right now. I was waiting for that to be the end of the conversation, not, well, thank you for participating and telling us about your pain and misery. Because that's sort of how I felt it was going down. And so that segment goes off and I go to work out and I'm like, dude, you can help her. Maybe part of it was a feeling of guilt. That was several weeks after the Major League All-Star game. I'm a big Yankees fan. It's been a hard year for me. I idolized Mariano Rivera, and they had him, celebrated him at the All-Star game, and I'm watching the game like, man, I don't have a Mariano Rivera jersey. I need to get a Mariano Rivera jersey. He's about to retire. And I'm thinking like, dude, you spent $100 on a Mariano Rivera jersey. And she just said, for some people, $50 doesn't mean anything. You need to help her. And so I said, let me start working on this. I worked out. I came back. I started tweeting the show. Hey, I need to get in touch with Tiana. I started looking online. Witnessed the Hunger Project. I found that, sent them information. I emailed the show. Then I found out she works with the Center for Hunger-Free Communities at Drexel. And I got in touch with Professor Mariana Chilton, who's nationally known in this area. I'm like, I need to get in touch with, I'm going to help her. So by the end of Sunday night, somebody had contacted me. I had her number by Monday morning. By Monday night, we had connected. A little over 24 hours. We talked at 9 o'clock at night. She said, let me call you back in a few minutes. I am walking home from work. And when I get home, I will call you. 9 o'clock, she is walking home in Philly. She gets to the house and she calls me. We talk about the cost of the shirts. She starts breaking down the cost for all these other things too. The most expensive item, the sweaters, they're like $30 a piece. I said, all right, I'm going to help you. I'm going to make sure that each of your kids has enough things to get through a week, each one of them. So I used a little Chase Quick Pay so I could send the money and email the link and she could get all the money and do all those kinds of things. For me, that was, and you talk about this idea of daring to be significant, I felt dared by that segment. I was being dared to do something and not just participate in that academic conversation about people struggling, and I'm listening to this woman struggle, and it's real, and we just like, okay, thank you, next segment. I couldn't do that. And so how do we develop that as a part of our being, that we just don't walk by like the priest and the Levite did, and there's somebody in need. That has to be a part of the conversation about values, that we just don't walk by. So to heal the hood, the neighborhoods, we need dangerous unselfishness, or daring you to be significant, to undo the rejection as well as promote those who are doing their best. Finally, we need to redefine what it means to be a neighbor. In one Bible commentary, they really talk about Samaritans, and I didn't know this. They said Samaritans were racially mixed, and there was this hostility between them and the Jews. The scholars wrote, had the Jew been alive and well, instead of being stripped, beaten, and left half dead, he would have rejected with indignation even an offer of water from the Samaritan. So the Samaritan moved with compassion that overcame religious and racial animosity, and he treated the Jew with a welcoming, hospitable, and warm, generous spirit. Now remember, this story of the Good Samaritan starts with the scribe, and the scribe is the lawyer. I'm not going to do the lawyer jokes. I live with one too. But the scribe was trying to trick Jesus with his question. Warren Risby says, of course, the lawyer wanted to make the issue somewhat complex and philosophical, but Jesus made it simple and practical. He moved from duty to love, from debating to doing. To be sure, our Lord was not condemning discussions or debates. He was only warning us not to use those as excuses for doing nothing. Committees are not always committed. So the question today, when we talk about values, is what are we going to do? What are we going to do? On my campus next Tuesday night, we're hosting a lecture by Clarence Jones. Clarence Jones was Martin Luther King's attorney. He actually co-wrote the I Have a Dream speech. And in his book, What Would King Say?, he talks about how Dr. King came to California to recruit him to be involved in the movement. And he had this nice house and all these things, and Jones was too busy. He couldn't do any of that. And so Dr. King said, all right, well, I'm preaching at this church tomorrow. I really hope you and your wife come and hear the sermon. So they acquiesce and they come to the church. And Dr. King says that in his sermon, he says, the text of this sermon concerns the role and responsibility of the Negro professional to the masses of our brothers and sisters who are struggling for civil rights in the South. So, of course, Dr. Jones is getting worried because he's listening to this sermon. And in the sermon, he talks about this attorney that he meets who's really bright and doing well. And he's like, he can't be talking about me because that guy sounds even better. But he says toward the end, he looks at him and he says, I'm afraid this gifted young man has forgotten from whence he came. And so after that, Clarence Jones was on board and became one of his closest. You got Martin Luther King calling you out of the sermon. So he felt bad about that. So I hope all of us here, students, faculty, staff, alums, anybody who's related to Stetson, understand that this is a privilege. It is a privilege to be in this space. And I had a chance to tour around and see the facilities and having a chance to meet some of the folks who were here. This is a privilege. It's also a responsibility. You can't just be here and enjoy all of this and just take it for yourself and you don't do anything, because then you are being insignificant. We have to have those moments that remind us. Even myself, I think I have to have moments like that too. And I had a very painful one this summer. I'm getting ready to pull off the mic. This summer, two kids. The oldest is 7. The youngest is 5 in November. And so we were having dinner. And we talked about at our church, and it's interesting because after the storm, there were these mergers of churches that probably would not have happened had not the storm happened. So First United Methodist Church, pretty much an all-white congregation. Grace United Methodist, all black. They merged. So it's now First Grace. So very interesting congregation, very diverse. Pastor is white. A lot of the music comes out of the African-American tradition. They have a program where they take the lead in feeding the homeless at the New Orleans Mission once a month. And we had talked about it, and so we were having dinner. My wife was like, yeah, I think they do that today. We should go, one of the families that takes the lead. And so my kids are just like, hollering like, yeah, let's go. And I'm just like, what do y'all know about this? And then I'm thinking like, ulterior motives. Like I said, my daughter is 7. And the family that takes the lead, they have a son who's like 9 or 10. So I think she likes this little boy. So she's excited, and my son, he just, whatever his sister likes is what he likes. So I said, my wife was driving. I said, well, you got an idea. Let's just ride by and sort of see. So we are riding in the car. I'm riding shotgun. And we get off the expressway, and we're like, oh, I think they're at the New Orleans Mission. We know it's on Aretha Castle Haley Boulevard. So we get off, and we say, yeah, that's where they are. So drive around. I'm telling her, drive around. So we drive around, and we're pulling up on this side to park. And here is a telephone pole. And as we pull up to park at that telephone pole, there is a man who is there. His back is against the pole like this. And I thought he was sitting all the way down, but he wasn't. As we get closer, then I realize that his pants are halfway down. And as she is about to park, she's saying, I can see the man reaching to the ground to grab vegetation so he could clean himself. This is 6 o'clock in the afternoon. It's in broad daylight. I said, move on down the next block. We at least have to make sure he has some sense of privacy and dignity in a very undignified position. So I'm 46. I've never seen anything like that before. I would argue that I had a Bienville moment. I discovered New Orleans. And so we go in, and they bring the food in, and the way it's set up is that the kids really could do most of the serving, and we could sort of supervise. And I'm standing there, and I'm watching maybe 100, 150 people come in. They had a worship service before. It was a very diverse group of people. There were more women than I expected to see. There were a lot of people who were dressed like many of you in here that I was surprised to even see in there, because if I had seen them out on Canal or in the French Quarter, I would not have expected to see them. And they were there for that meal. This just happened. This is July. It's July of this year. That there are people in our communities who are struggling. And the question for all of us in terms of these values, and particularly in the academic community, and we're pleased with ourselves because we have these values, they don't mean anything if we don't do anything with them. They mean absolutely nothing. We can go through these academic exercises and say this and that, but there are real people out there who have needs, and we're like the Levite and the priest. Oh, I'll let somebody else deal with that. I don't have time. Those are the kinds of things that we're going to have to address. And I think we all need these moments, whether we've lived them or not. I didn't live any of those moments. But through my interaction with Tiana or at the New Orleans Mission, those were things that reminded me of my responsibility. It was, if I can once again, it was a dare for me to become significant. In fact, as I close, Dr. King actually preached from this text, and he preached from many different things. And so this is how because he related it to their support of striking workers. King said, and so the first question that the priest asked, the first question that the Levite was asked, if I stop to help this man, what will happen to me? But then the Good Samaritan came by, and he reversed the question. If I do not stop to help this man, what will happen to him? That's the question before you tonight. Not if I stop to help the sanitation workers, what will happen to my job? Not if I stop to help the sanitation workers, what will happen to all of the hours I usually spend in my office every day and every week as a pastor? The question is not if I stop to help this man in need, what will happen to me? The question is, if I do not stop to help the sanitation workers, what will happen to them? That is the question. And that's the question I pose to you today, as you have these conversations about our values. If we don't stop to help people in our neighborhoods, in our communities, what will happen to them? What will happen to single mothers who really don't know how they're going to buy clothes for school or get something to eat for their children? What's going to happen to all of the children who have no relationships with their fathers? What about children who in some places are still teased because they excel academically and sort of dumb down their performance? What about the numbers of young people who are killed as collateral damage in these reckless wars? I've been president of Dillard for 3 months, and I was at my first funeral of one of my freshman students who actually attended church with me, who was shot in a house because they were shooting at somebody else. What about those people? What about people who are being in abusive relationships and being beaten by a spouse or a significant other? What about children who are being sexually abused by relatives? What happens to all these people if we just keep walking by? What happens to them? So in summary, our communities need neighbors, plain and simple. This has to be more than just this campus community. It has to be a neighborhood. And your neighborhood extends not only in this city, but it can be everywhere. I viewed Tiana Gaines as my neighbor, and she was in Philadelphia. She was my neighbor. And so how do we start looking at each other as neighbors? I think Mr. Rogers sums it up very clearly for me. He ends his song by saying, "So let's make the most of this beautiful day. Since we're together, we might as well say, won't you be mine? Could you be mine? Won't you be my neighbor? Won't you please? Won't you please? Please, won't you be my neighbor?" Thank you.